Um, Making sure this goes live. Hold on.
Alex, do you like Ian's background?
Yeah, I like it. It's very fitting. First test.
Figured.
Oh, Bezos.
Nope, I think. Here we go.
Alex, do you like Ian's background?
It's live.
Oh,
Okay. Nope, I think. Here we go.
Alex, do you like Ian's background?
It's live.
See, I can hear it in the background.
Okay.
The live stream.
Not anymore.
Okay, great.
Probably, how did you put the theme? How did you put your website together? Did you like pick a theme, pick a template from somewhere?
Did you want to mute everybody, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah,
don't know
so
why that
similar
happened.
thing for us. So similar thing, took that.
Everyone's muted now. Nope. Including us.
All right, great. Should we get started? Or do you want to keep letting some people in?
There's still people.
Okay. Okay, cool. Cool. Hi, Rebecca. Nice to see you again. Yeah, we've got MTV Cribs from Hal. I mean, that's exciting.
Intro. Can you see? Why am I not? Why is my camera not working?
What's up?
I'm listening.
Everyone's getting muted.
Yeah. It's like, all right, let's see. Cool.
I just
Ian-
wanted, before we start, it's good to see some people have returned from last week. That's awesome. It means that it wasn't too painful. So it's nice to see the returning faces.
We've got our special guest, Jeff Bezos, on the Zoom, right, standing right behind Ian. So that's exciting. Not creepy at all.
I was going to do that. He's standing right behind me, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. All right, Ian, just say the word and we can get started.
I guess we still got people flowing in here. So
Okay, cool. Great.
We still let some people in.
I mean, I think it'll.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
All right, why don't we get started?
Yeah, great. Well, welcome back, everyone, for week 2 of the Always Day One Book Club. Just like physical books. You've got myself and Ian moderating and just being general goofballs. And we've got our author, Alex, joining again, which we were so excited about. So today's topic is Amazon. I'm pretty sure all of our homes have like that weird random corner where all the Amazon boxes are sitting because they're quarantined for a few days before you Lysol wipe them down and open them. But fascinating topic. So today we're going to kick it off. Alex kind of spoke about this a little bit last week, but he alluded to his pre-journalist life. And it sounded fascinating. So we've asked him to kind of, expand on that a little bit. So throwing it over to you, Alex.
Yeah. So it's definitely a weird route. And I also see some Cornell folks here on the chat. So they probably have, similar experience. But a lot of us came out of school right in the depth of the financial crisis. And I remember, the president of the school just talking about how proud he was that, there's such a huge percentage of the graduates that have jobs. And I was sitting in the audience and being like, okay, what would that be like? Because I'm going to my parents' couch after this. And so I studied industrial and labor relations, as I think Judah also did, right? So we learned a lot about how organizations function. We learned about culture and human resources, organizational behavior. And it was an opportunity to learn how companies work. But when it came to putting it into practice, no one was picking up the phone because all these companies were crumbling. So I just kind of scrapped. Came back to New York, and I was like, well, what industries are strong here? And there was this movement of, the digital advertising industry was starting to grow. People were starting to learn that you can advertise on the internet and actually get an ROI on it. Like that was a big question. Like, is there an ROI in social media? And no one really knew. Obviously now all the billions of dollars put into companies like Facebook and Twitter, that helped answer that question. I think Craig was actually at some of those meetups that, that we talked about in New York City back in the day. So I worked as a marketer for New York City's Economic Development Corporation, buying ads, and then sold ad tech for a year at a company called Operative, which is actually mentioned in the last chapter, a leader of the future. And that company ended up struggling pretty badly, and I got laid off from it. So that was an interesting experience. And then I just sort of realized at a certain point that like I'd much rather start. I saw all these new stories emerging in the world of digital advertising that were just being missed by the media, and just thought I'd much rather be a reporter covering that stuff. And having done that, like it gave me this interesting perspective, because I had a good idea of where the bodies were buried in ad tech, having worked in it for a little bit of time. And so then I went to Ad Age and started covering sort of like, okay, all the problems in the digital advertising industry, everything from fraud to the fact that advertisers were buying non-viewable impressions, which the advertising folks in this conversation know well, basically ads that were loading outside of the browser. And I also had like an interesting look into programmatic advertising, like advertising that was taking place via automation. Our ad tech company was like the one ad tech company that was supporting direct sold ad inventory. So ad inventory sold over the phone versus by machines. And that didn't end up being great business. But it was this interesting look into like the problems with programmatic. And so like having covered that at Ad Age, like that was kind of a cool entryway into doing real business journalism, looking at an industry. And then, the whole the independent digital advertising industry started to fade a little bit when Facebook, Google, Snapchat, and Twitter started picking up all of the advertising money. So then it became like an option of like stay in New York and write obituaries for the ad tech world, or move to Silicon Valley and start covering where the action was. And so like I had applied to BuzzFeed a couple of times in the past and gotten rejected. I think I can tell the story. So one time I thought, okay, I'm in, I got in, like I had a really great interview on their like newly formed business team. And I got a call from Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed at the time. And I'm like, all right, here we go, job offer. And it was right after like the Boston bombing. And so, and he calls me up. I said, hey, Ben, great to hear from you. He said, hey, Alex, Ben Smith from BuzzFeed. I said, okay, hey, what's going on? He goes, do you speak Russian? I said, wait, do I speak Russian? I think he was looking for someone to comb VK, the Russian social media, to find a trace of the Tsarevs who had done the bombing. And I didn't speak Russian. So I said, Ben, I don't speak Russian. And he said, oh, okay, for some reason I thought you did. Bye. And I didn't get the job. So, I said, okay, fine. I applied to BuzzFeed one last time, because it was a place I wanted to be. I really believed in Ben, what he was doing there. And then finally, having that ad background, they thought, okay, it would be a good person. I'd be in a good position to cover the companies like Facebook, Google, and Twitter and Snapchat, given that that was the business model. And when you understand the business, you have a chance to like start to do some damage on the beat. And that's how I made my way to Silicon Valley. So really weird route with some interesting stops along the way, but that's sort of how it happened.
Probably maybe around that same time, Ben Smith at BuzzFeed actually, one of the BuzzFeed News early stories was actually Ben doing an interview with me, unmasking me as the Twitter of Invisible Obama.
That's right. Well, the Clint Eastwood chair.
That is correct. That is correct. That was me, and it was weird. But I think that's probably a good segue, actually. To kind of, we're talking about like people who hire a lot of people for particular beats and then their job changes. Is Amazon, right? Which is the subject of the first chapter of this book. Curious, kind of going into Amazon and getting access, the kind of access that you got into Amazon, which is notoriously difficult to do. I was wondering, like, kind of how that, like, what was the genesis of that? Is it like you call and you're like, hey, I'm Alex from BuzzFeed, I want to do a story. It seems like that would be something they would initially be allergic to, much less a chapter in a book written about them, given that they're still referring to the New York Times story.
So I was surprised. This is the first book that Amazon's participated in since the Everything Store, which came out like 5 years ago. So they'd been alert. They didn't really like how the Everything Store came out, and they'd been allergic to working with the press on anything pretty much, especially books. And I don't know 100% why they decided to work with me, but it wasn't as simple as picking up the phone and asking. So actually the genesis, so I was telling Orchid before, but this is the Amazon chapter is the first chapter I wrote in the book, even before the introduction. And it was the first company that I really wanted to dig into. I had some knowledge of how Facebook and Google work just because of being in Silicon Valley. I had seen that, but I knew nothing about Amazon. And I came in and basically told them, I don't know anything about your company. But I think what might have done it is I showed up to Seattle without a book deal. And we were still in the process of trying to sell the book. And I had agreed to cat sit this cat lady, who we actually shout out in the acknowledgements, and basically said, like, either I'm going to get a book deal and I'm going to start reporting and I'm not going to leave Seattle until I'm done, or I'm not going to get a book deal and I'm going to spend 3 weeks with Lady and then find my way back to Silicon Valley. And so we ended up selling the book the day after I landed in Seattle, which was great. And I still got to spend time with the cat, which was also cool. And I think there's going to be a feature about my time with the cat in BuzzFeed's This Week in Cats newsletter, which I think is probably the widest distribution of any newsletter we have. So stand by for that. But yeah, so anyway, I just basically showed up and told the Amazon PR person, like, look, I just want to understand your culture. I'm not doing a hit piece. And also, by the way, like, I'm not leaving Seattle until I'm done. And then they agreed to participate, which was pretty cool. It wasn't, it was interesting, right? Because I did get the access. I got to speak with Jeff Wilke, who's Bezos' number 2, went to 2 robotic enabled fulfillment centers, one on each coast. And then I spoke, probably the most interesting guy is the person that ran this automation initiative called Hands Off the Wheel, I don't think he's ever done a press interview before. So that was interesting to speak with him. But all the interviews happened from the last day I was in Seattle and onward, which was interesting. I think Amazon really wanted to hold those back till they had an idea of like where I was going with this thing. But yeah, I think that those 6 weeks in Seattle that I spent actually gave me an opportunity to sit down with Amazon employees and ex-Amazon employees and just say, tell me everything about what you do. And just going in with that blank slate like helped a lot in terms of being able to figure out what's going on inside that company.
Yeah, I mean, you begin the chapter with talking about the 14 principles. And I think the one that is most popular is being customer obsessed, right? You're starting to hear large legacy companies talk about it, and everybody's kind of holding up this mantle about customer obsession and customer first. You know, with the 14 principles, it seems like there's like an indoctrination in the company. Where are they posted? Like, how do people become aware of this? Like, how often is this used day to day at Amazon?
Yeah, because most companies, you have like a company mission and vision, and people talk about it maybe in orientation and never discuss it ever again. And in Amazon, it's so baked into the fiber of like the way that they work inside that company. It's amazing. So the first thing is the 14 leadership principles inside Amazon are available like on careers.amazon.com. You can just Google Amazon leadership principles and you can see them. Okay, the way that they hammer them into people, well, first of all, they interview almost entirely based off of the leadership principles. So they'll like in your interview at Amazon, they'll say like, well, give us an example of one time you showed bias to action. Like bias to action is one of these principles. And then a person will have to, so it's all behavioral. It's not necessarily credential based. It's like, how would you fit in inside Amazon's culture? That makes the big difference. And then, yeah, it's a language they just use inside the company. And they're so ingrained inside Amazon employees that the funniest things is when you're hanging out with Amazon employees off the clock. Like I would go to brunch with Amazon employees and they would like converse with each other through the leadership principles. I would speak with Amazon people who have married their colleagues, and they say that their marriages are sort of mediated by the leadership principles. And some people even say that they teach the leadership principles to their kids. So this is like literally, like I write in the book that the Amazonians follow these principles more closely than their own religions. That wasn't glib. I think that's actually true, which is interesting. put
So
it
my
that way.
question with culture and like the idea of cultural fit in corporations is that oftentimes it's used as a way to limit diversity, right? Like you end up just hiring all the same people who think alike, who look alike, like that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
did you see whether or not these 14 principles or this culture idea of a tight cultural fit, did that kind of increase or decrease the idea of like diversity or like difference of opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think. Also, Ian mentioned that if you guys have questions, you can just drop them in the chat, and we'll get to them. Definitely want like participation from everyone who wants. Okay, so diversity. I think. Well, here's an interesting thing. Amazon, I believe, is more diverse than almost all the other tech giants. Maybe it is the most diverse tech giants in terms of race and gender. So that's interesting. I don't really believe that the company is very interested in diversity of thought. I think that people just sort of come in and are taught the Amazon way and are schooled in how to, think, breathe, and live Amazon. We talked last week a little bit about like the lack of empathy inside Amazon. And I don't really think that empathy is not a leadership principle. And I don't really think that empathy is something that's taught or desired very much inside the company. I mean, there's this great Frontline documentary about Amazon that everyone should go watch if you're interested in the company, where like they interview some of these executives about crushing small businesses. And they go, yeah, what do you expect? It's the retail business. Of course, we're going to crush the little guy. This is sort of drilled into the company. So I don't really think that it's a company that feedback, right, which we're going to talk about next week, is really valued in terms of, is this an ethical decision for us? And actually, even last week, Amazon fired a couple of its tech employees for speaking up on behalf of workers. So there is a problem in that. Like, I think that like it's a good point, and maybe I should have addressed this more in the book. But yeah, if you build your culture around these principles so tightly, you could end up in situations where you end up, having this sort of groupthink in a way that puts blinders on what you should be doing versus what you are doing.
So can we talk about the ruthlessness for a sec?
Mm-hmm.
So as I'm reading the chapter, it wasn't like I didn't keep thinking about Jeff Bezos. I kept thinking about like Thanos from the Avengers, which is like literally like with the snap of their fingers, they could put 50% of retailers out of business.
Yeah.
Not to mention the notion that of how inevitable like they are, because at the rate that they grow, and you refer to this frequently, both like textually and in subtext, that they can infinitely scale, right? And that is part of the balance between taking like the best of humans and the best of machines, and building something that can effectively deliver the kind of like both logistics and even product to serve almost like not only an entire country, but potentially the entire world. And there's also a line in there where you say, and he has no plans of like slowing down anytime soon, right? There's no like sunsetting of Amazon, making way for like the next upstart, right? And so, like, are they conscious of that? Are they literally building like, do they understand their place in the retail universe or ecosystem, or are they just trying to replace it?
Yeah, they know they're powerful. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. They know they're powerful. One thing I'll say about that is, this is something I've been thinking about. I actually would love to hear people's thoughts on this, but they're a platform, right? And so they remarkably haven't gotten to the scale they have by being a first party seller. Actually, that's become subset in their business. And Hands Off the Wheel, the automation program, has actually helped them, take their first party platform and subset it and make room for this third party marketplace. So it's not so much like, okay, the Walmart example is Walmart. Let's say Walmart's working with Rubbermaid to buy garbage cans. Some of the folks that have been at Cornell ILR, like Judah, probably remember this example. But when Walmart works with a company and wants to like supply garbage cans in its store, what it does is it says, we're the only source of demand, and you are going to supply it to us at the price that we want, and we know how many people are going to buy, right? That's completely opposite from typically would go the other way, where the manufacturer would set the price, and then retailers would decide if they wanted to, to stock them, and they'd compete against each other to give the manufacturer the best deal. So Walmart's actually did this reverse supply chain where they're like, we are the one source of supply, and you're going to give us the price we want. Amazon could have done that, right? But instead what they did was open up their site to third parties to sell. So anybody can go now and sell on Amazon. And what that does is, even though it makes Amazon big, it also opens up the opportunity for small businesses to work inside the Amazon platform and use its fulfillment services and scale up in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So I'm thinking that like maybe it's not necessarily that Amazon is just growing big and crushing everyone. I mean, certainly they've crushed people, but they also open up this opportunity to people who know the system to become the next small business, right? Because if we're all moving online and we're moving from Main Street, especially now, right? But we're moving from Main Street to the internet. The mom and pop shops are also moving online. And the person who might have opened a corner store selling all different things inside your community now has a corner store. It's just something that's accessible to everybody through Amazon's third-party marketplace and fulfillment services. So in that case, they're actually, and it doesn't get talked about a lot because you're not supposed to say this about Amazon, but it does open up opportunity for small businesses that are willing to take the risk and learn the system. And people who do it well actually end up making a lot of money.
So reminder to everybody, we'll start opening this up to Q&A at about 8:30, so in about 8 minutes. But one thing that, stood out in the chapter was that every Amazonian had, and it's weird saying Amazonian, by the way, but every Amazonian had embraced this idea of working yourself out of a job, right? So my question is, that idea and that like just embrace of it, can that only happen at an Amazon, or can it happen in other places too?
Yeah, like in the chapter, there's like 3 employees in a row who are like, my job got automated, and that's awesome. So that was one of the most surprising things that I found in my reporting, was that they were actually pretty gung-ho about finding ways. And there's this leadership principle inside Amazon: invent and simplify. You invent something new, you simplify all the processes that have worked to underpin it, and then you invent again. And I think that like, so that's why they're saying, I want to work myself out of a job, which is that, which essentially means I want to go invent something new and then simplify it and then find a way to invent again. And I think I don't think this is Amazon specific. And I also think that like when they say work ourselves out of a job, it doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean they want to automate so they can fire themselves. It means they want to work themselves out of the job they're doing today so they can end up doing the job that's going to lead the company into the future, right? To build the next thing, build what's coming tomorrow. And so, yeah, I do think that like we spoke last week about the 2 different types of work. There's idea work and execution work. And what the tech giants have done really well is minimized execution work to make room for companies to make room for their employees to spend more time coming up with ideas. And that applies for Amazon. Like what these Amazon employees are saying is, I want to work myself out of a job. I want to minimize the execution work so I can spend more time on idea work. And I do think that like if you have a company that's dedicated to, am I still on? If you have a company that's dedicated to this idea, right? If a company that says we're going to embrace automation, process simplification, technology that's going to help us minimize the work that we do to support existing products, so we can make room to build new ones, you're going to be in good shape no matter whether you're in Amazon or you're elsewhere. But the second companies say, we want to work yourself out of a job to fire you, that's when you get into trouble. So that's why they're so gung-ho, because they know that they have a company that will support them, when they want to end up automating and then moving on to the next thing. And I'll just give one example. I think, did we give it last week? I'll just do it one more time. There was this guy who worked on pricing and promotions, Dilip Kumar, and he, pricing and promotions got automated by an Amazon program called Hands Off the Wheel, which took basically all the tasks in the retail organization, put them on autopilot, and said, okay, now go do something else. And then Dilip Kumar, he spent a couple of years, or a little bit over a year, under Bezos, working with him as his technical advisor, which means you basically go and you study everything that Bezos does, and then you go do something big afterwards. And one of the people that did that first was Andy Jassy, who ended up going to found Amazon Web Services. So this guy Dilip goes and does the same job, studies under Bezos, and then he finishes it up, and he's ready to go do something else. But pricing and promotions has all been automated by hands off the wheel. And then so he goes and gets together with a bunch of people in the retail organization and says, okay, how can we eliminate the most annoying part of checkout? And that's where they ended up founding Amazon Go, right? So actually, Amazon worked Dilip out of a job, but it wasn't to fire him. It was to say, you are good at what you do. You're a problem solver more than just someone who does this specific task. So now how can we take your ingenuity and put it on something else? And they gave him the problem, which was solving the most annoying part of shopping in real life. And he went out and invented, Amazon Go. So he probably was thrilled that he invented himself out of the job, because it kept things interesting and allowed him to go out and work together with people inside the company to build something that's really going to be important for Amazon going forward.
I find that actually like one of the more like compelling justifications for working at Amazon, right? Knowing that if you're good enough to work there on a particular job, you're also likely, because of the left brain, right brain makeup that they place such a priority on, to be able to do something else in another area, and maybe even better than the job that we hired you to do. And I think that's super interesting. But I also wonder that, like, given the size of the company, like the sheer scale and how different the sets of skills are between, kind of like office executives and warehouse workers, they make a lot of assumptions about the reasons why somebody is loyal to the company, right? And and how incentives work. The most obvious incentive, to drive loyalty being stock, right? Which is money, especially at the price that Amazon stock is at. And I think that's fine, but I wonder how that translates between like the top and the bottom, right? Because they don't want to create like caste systems internally. And they, you even report on like just like how many upskilling opportunities there are, right? Like someone who works on the floor can become, someone who could be working on the robotics that are operating the floor and so on. I wonder if that is for everyone, or it just needs to be for enough people to want to continue to work there and grow inside of the organization and reduce their churn. So, I mean, that's kind of like a culture thing, but obviously, like as a company their size, they've had issues with the culture in the past. I wonder how they've had to deal with that, especially with the volatility of the stock market.
Yeah. So, it's a great question. So the reason why I ended the chapter on this section called outputs is because I think that like the thing that I learned from the Amazonian, I mean, obviously money plays a part in it, but the thing I learned most from the employees there was that they were interested more in the way that Amazon would transform their thinking, like to teach them how to think like somebody who understands the process, and more than necessarily the money, because they knew that would end up, distracted by the toothbrushing. they knew that they would end up with a skill set that would benefit them throughout the rest of their careers. So that's what people actually spoke to me about. The cool thing was, how do you think like an Amazon employee versus how much money do I make? And you actually kind of see that throughout the chapter, is that the people who have been through the Amazon process now have gone on to become pretty effective CEOs in their own right, like largely because of what they built. It wasn't that they got a bunch of money, from Amazon and then ended up, capable of bootstrapping. So, but yeah, in terms of like the money and the disparity between the warehouse workers and, can you ask that question one more time? Where do you get?
I guess. So I guess like, think about it, even if it's like the military, right? Like you're going into military and people in different ranks are just by definition, like treated differently, right? And so like a warehouse worker, that kind of path of evolution is very different than say an executive's path of internal evolution. I wonder like how the same party line reconciles that between, the people who have to pull the kinds of shifts that they have to pull in the warehouse versus the ones who are, given the ability to like telecommute.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess like, I'm not going to say that it's a good job to be a warehouse worker at Amazon. It's tough. It's really hard. But they do a few things well that I think keep people there. One is they pay a minimum wage $15. which, they should have been doing before they had political pressure from Bernie Sanders to do that. But they also, it's still double the federal minimum wage, which is pretty good. And then the other thing they do is they have this, and I noted in the chapter, there's a continuous improvement kiosk in the warehouse, where if you have an idea for a way to improve processes there, like you're encouraged to go submit it. So there is like an invention component to people's job, and there is an upskilling component to people's job. So I think our general picture about what it's like to work in an Amazon warehouse is that it's hell. I'm not going to say that it's great, but it's probably a little better than a lot of the reports that you hear.
One last question for me selfishly before we go into Q&A. So you talk about trying to trick the Amazon Go store. Does that mean you were actively trying to shoplift?
Great question. That's an ethical question, right? I guess I was trying to shoplift. But it's also like they're kind of daring you, right? Because they're saying come in and use our technology, use our technology enabled store, and you're going to be fine. You won't have to pay. So yeah, of course I'm going to try to trick it. I mean, have to do. I'm sure they're prepared for everybody to do it. But yeah, so far never been successful, and I tried it a bunch of times after publishing the book as well, or submitting the final book. And if anyone's able to do it, let me know, because I really have been unable to, and it's sort of a continuing point of frustration for me. So
cool. All right, so maybe we let's go to Ben Cruz, who I think hopefully I'm gonna unmute him. Oh good, yeah, I see he's paying attention. All right, so this is great. Hey Ben, over to you.
Hey, thanks. Hi Alex, thanks for doing this. Question about kind of the people who really do instill those Amazon values and then go on to other companies. I'm sure they move around other tech giants. Have you seen or heard any stories about those Amazon values kind of fitting into some other existing culture?
Yeah, it's tough, because I think that the Amazonians get so obsessed with these values that they find it difficult to work everywhere else. And I mentioned in the chapter that a lot of them boomerang, right? Everyone knows a boomerang is you go somewhere and you come back because you can't cut it somewhere else. So I do think that it requires some soft skills, right? People need to be able to take what they've learned at this company if they really want to get what the main benefit, which is learning the process. They need to be able to take what they've learned at the company and then go into their next job and believe that there's going to be things that they can apply and it will make them better, and there's going to be things they need to let go. And that being able to let go is super important, because otherwise you're going to be working at Jeff Bezos's company while you have a different CEO, and you're going to just cause friction among your coworkers. But yeah, throughout like the reporting process, I've talked to people who work with people who've been at Amazon, and it's always like, oh, it's a challenge working with those Amazon people, but they have some good ideas. So I think it's definitely a mixed bag, but those that have been able to let go of some of the orthodoxy that surround these principles inside the company have done really well in their next stops.
So it is possible. Yep.
It's possible. It's hard.
Yeah.
If you're somebody who comes into like a PowerPoint culture and says, I'm handing you a memo and that's how we're going to do it, then you're going to be in trouble. But if you make the case for the memo and try to get your coworkers to experiment with it, then you could end up in a much better place, because the memo can really work in some companies. But yeah, I mean, it's the sense is, there's definitely like this sense of superiority. It is like this, again, it's like kind of a religious tribal thing, right? So once people are able to let go of that, they end up doing pretty well, because there are good things that you can apply from it. And that's why I wrote the book about all like 5 of the tech companies, not just an Amazon book, because yeah, you can pick and choose different things that you like from each company and put them into place in your place of work. But yeah, it's definitely not that Amazon is the be all end all of workplace culture. And once Amazonians let go of that, they do really well.
All right, great. We've got a question from Lynn. Lynn, you're up.
Yep, thanks. Hey guys. So for me, what I was most intrigued or curious about from the book, Bezos actually banned the use of PowerPoint in the company. So I wanted to ask you, do they ban that for externals communications as well as it just internals? Would you have like a sample memos that you can share with us so we can have a look as reference?
Yeah.
So I'm very curious as to how it works. Thanks.
Yes, I'll tell a quick story before I answer that question directly. But so when I was done with the first draft of the book, I had like 10 people show up to my apartment and I said, bring your laptops. And I opened up a Google Doc of the book and said, comment at will, tell me what makes sense, what you like and what you don't like. And I just used this as a tool for me to sort of figure out what was resonating and what wasn't, what was confusing and what was clear. And generally what was kind of silly. And I have to say, like, that sort of thing, it was almost like a memo in and of itself, right? And that sort of thing helped me really dial in the book in a way that it wasn't before. The one thing that people really stopped on was the PowerPoint thing, which to me was so interesting. And it shows me how big of a pain in the ass PowerPoint is in so many different companies, and how like writing things out. So just to recap, people that are inside Amazon, when they start a new project, they write it out in a 6-page memo. It's single space, 11-point font, no pictures, and it's meant to help them clarify their thinking. And also it's a tool for them to get their ideas to anyone inside the organization. I don't know if they, actually, it's a good question whether they use that externally as well. Like if you're an Amazon salesperson, are you like going to your clients and being like,
No,
okay,
we get a lot of decks.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so they sell externally with those, but yeah, the internal projects, they seem to work pretty well when they use this memo. I don't think there's ever been an Amazon 6-page memo that's been made public. I think Amazon may release one of them on its blog at a certain point, based off of some things I've heard. So I will send it around to the group if I'm able to get my hands on one. But the one that I was able to see before publishing the book, unfortunately, it was just looking over someone's shoulder who had saved the 6-pager and said, hey, take a look at this. And I just saw, and it was amazing how much detail there was on it. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to, well, I was only able to look at it and not save it, unfortunately. But it would be good for the world to see what these things look like, because they're a pretty interesting way to kick off a project.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think we've got Hal up next with a question. Hal, you're up.
Hi, how's it going?
How are you?
So my question is about the tech advisor position.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned in the book that there are a lot of tech advisors who've gone on to either tackle big problems or do really cool, interesting things. You mentioned AWS. You mentioned, you've already talked about Amazon Go a little bit. So the current tech advisor is Wei Gao. I just looked it up on CNBC.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about her, but what's she up to? Where do you think she's going to go next?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I haven't spoken with her before. But yeah, it's a cool job. Like, I don't know. I think Jeff Wilke also has one, who's Bezos' number 2, and he's in the chapter, because when I met with Wilke, someone just very silently sat down and shadowed him and took notes. And I was like, is that probably a technical advisor? I think it's really cool. It's a really cool idea inside Amazon. And I'll just give you guys a preview for next week, but Zuckerberg has this tendency to want to be like technical advisor for a day or a week. And when you read the Facebook chapter, you'll see that he shadowed Don Graham, who was the former owner of the Washington Post, for a couple of days. And Don was just like, you don't need to follow me. And Zuckerberg's like, no, I want to. And actually spent a bunch of days in DC shadowing Don Graham as he ran like one of the world's biggest newspapers. So then Zuckerberg, he writes to Don Graham and he's like, I'd like to shadow Bezos too. Can you make the introduction? And Don said, yeah, sure. So he gives Bezos a call, and Bezos goes, so I'll just, like, the context is that when Zuckerberg followed Don Graham, he was basically a nobody, and nobody in the Washington Post knew him. By the time he asked to shadow Bezos, he was already pretty famous. And so Bezos goes to Don Graham and he goes, Don, that's an interesting idea. But the only thing more distracting than having Mark Zuckerberg follow me around would be having Angelina Jolie follow me around for a couple of days. So unfortunately, I have to say no. And it's funny because like I had never heard of this idea of the technical advisor beforehand, but now it's kind of like a job that I mean, I guess maybe as a reporter it makes sense, but I really want a job like that. Like it sounds really cool. So we'll find out. I'm sure the person that you mentioned will end up going and running some big Amazon business pretty shortly. I mean, definitely seeing some crazy shit go down in that company right now.
So Sonia, first of all, hi, and you've got a question. So I think we're going to unmute you here.
Thank you. Hi.
Hi,
So my question is, you mentioned that they added in their reviews that they just list their superpowers, and I'm curious how they use those superpowers in deciding how people move around the company or how they get promoted.
That's a great question. I don't really know the answer to that one. Amazon promotion and compensation has been a bit of a mystery to me. And it seems like it's something that's still in progress. So I'm not quite sure, but here's something that's interesting is that the superpowers are also related to those leadership principles, which are the way that they structure work and the way that they hire. And I would imagine there's some consistency in terms of figuring out the next job that you're going to go into. Similar to the way that they hire based off of the principles. So if there's one thing we take away from today, it's that Amazon's obsessed with those leadership principles in a way that you don't see in many other companies.
So Alex, before we jump to the next question, really want to make sure we address the original New York Times article about Amazon because another one dropped today. So in the original one, in your chapter, you mentioned that they refer to it as like that New York Times article.
Yeah.
And so I have a quote here, Jay Carney, who was their spokesperson at the time, had said that, there was an ex-employee that spoke about like there was crying every day in the office, right? And so Jay goes out there and his quote about this employee was, his brief tenure at Amazon ended after an investigation revealed he had attempted to defraud vendors and conceal it by falsifying business records. When confronted with the evidence, he admitted it and resigned immediately. Now, this sounds very similar to the story a few weeks ago about that employee who was fired who was trying to unionize a lot of the fulfillment center workers. Amazon also pulled, a page from the same playbook and kind of, said like, not nice things about the employee, right? Questioning his like mental aptitude and things like that. Like, is this out of the Amazon playbook? Like, is this what they do every time?
Oh yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like they seek to demonize their opponents and make them the face of something. And actually it's very interesting, right? So Carney addressed the problem. It's the same thing that they did in both places, right? Carney addressed the problem with the employee, talking about his employee file, which I think is kind of ethically dubious. And he used that as a way to try to discredit the whole story. And you'll see in the chapter that Dean Baquet actually hits back, the New York Times editor-in-chief, and is basically like, he was representative of a number of employees that had the similar complaints. Same with this guy in the warehouses, right? Like Amazon's trying to discredit him to make him the focal point of the protest because they said internally that he wasn't articulate and he'd be a good person to, use as like a scarecrow or boogeyman. And it's amazing, just like address the actual concerns, not the people doing it. Like if Amazon, it's much easier, and Amazon knows this, right? It's much easier to talk about someone's credentials than it is to talk about the actual problem at hand. It's like politicians that resort to ad hominem attacks when they don't want to address the substance of the actual policy. They say, oh, you did this. Well, why don't you talk about how the policy would affect people? They don't like doing that. So they know, and of course, no surprise, right? Carney is a political animal. So yeah, I mean, the Times probably could have done a better job picking the main source in that article, right? Like they probably knew what was going on, and they might have just gotten someone to go on record. So there is this sort of extra burden on journalists as well to make sure that they highlight, people with impenetrable credentials because we now know the attack that Amazon is coming with. But yeah, there's definitely a consistent playbook.
A follow-up to that question is, in that original case of the New York Times article that came out that Jay Carney addressed, in your chapter, you highlight that, the idea of input output. So there was like this feedback loop within the company to understand, like, if the output is that New York Times article, then what were the inputs that contributed to it? Now, do you think, and it sounds like there was some improvement in the company after that article came out. Now, with the union case a couple weeks ago, do you think Amazon's going to follow that same process? And do you think that actually good will come out of it?
No, I think Amazon will do whatever it can to crush that union. Yeah, Amazon will fight the union extremely hard.
Thank you. And let's go over to Ezra.
Can I just ask just one quick question while we're still on this New York Times story from today. There's the story is about like kind of Bezos like digging back in, basically, which feels very Igerish, right? Like in the sense that like Bob Iger kind of steps back a little bit. He's like, I'm not going to have day-to-day, control anymore. I'm going to turn it over to somebody else. Coronavirus hits, chaos breaks, the parks close, and he just elevated the parks guy to the CEO, right? So he's back in. It feels like that's kind of what's happening here as well. And I'm curious if this is like Bezos take the wheel, so to speak, because of the fact that he's like, screw it, I'll do it myself. Just given like all the potential downside of having to deal with all of this, given the tremendous stress that's on this organization from a logistics standpoint. Is it more like is it more like taking control as a control freak, or is it because people kind of turn to him and it's like Jeff, we need you to guide us through this?
Yeah, I think it's pretty consistent with. First of all, I think that the New York Times probably downplayed Bezos' role inside the company, because I kept thinking inside, when I had heard that, okay, Bezos was not as involved in daily operations. And so I was like, well, why is he still there? Right? He could be gone. He has a lot of money. He has another company that he cares about in Blue Origin trying to get to space. So why is he still at Amazon? Actually, I think what we've seen with Bezos is not very inconsistent with the whole idea in the book. If you read the New York Times article today closely, which talks about how he takes the reins back at Amazon, they say that he was involved in long-term projects, as if that's something that's inconsistent in Amazon culture and that a leader should be involved in the day-to-day. And they say that he also trusted his leaders to run the business. I mean, this is almost the ultimate example of a CEO concentrating on day one versus day two, or idea work versus execution work. Like, where's Bezos's energy best concentrated? Probably on what's going to come next, the long-term projects, versus what's happening now, which is, supporting the existing businesses. So I think that like what's happened is he was focused on keeping the company in day one, which is what are we going to invent next? How do we figure out what next ideas we need to bring to bear to figure out how to invent our way into the future? Okay, but then there's this trauma, which is coronavirus hits. And all of a sudden, these other divisions, which you had sort of set on autopilot, don't work as well as they used to. You can't have your hands off the wheel in the middle of coronavirus. You need to put them on, right? And so that's what I think is happening, is Bezos was doing what he set up the company to do, which was focusing on idea work, focusing on the long term, focusing on what's going to happen next. And this is a unique circumstance where he has to go back on the execution and back towards the flagship businesses and make sure that it can get out of this crisis okay. But it is sort of a testament to what he's been trying to do, that the Times could even write that sentence. I mean, with this guy, he's taken himself out, yet the core businesses were functioning so well. And that doesn't happen by accident. It's a product of culture. And that's something that Bezos has very intentionally built in his time at the head of the company.
All right, it is Ezra's turn to ask his question.
All right, thank you. Alex, first off, I want to say that I love the book. Also, my question is, what's the most interesting thing that you've learned about Amazon that didn't make the final cut in the book?
Oh, people love asking this question. I mean, I put the good stuff in. I think I talked about this last week about, I talked about the garbage collection? No?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. So one of the guys in the book, Neil Ackerman, who's like a pretty big voice inside the Amazon chapter, he and I, we must have spoken 4, 5, 6 times throughout the course of this. And he basically taught me Amazon culture ground up. And so we were talking about how the leadership is receptive to all ideas, even if they're outlandish. And so he said that he once wrote a 6-pager and brought it to leadership that made the case that Amazon should start its own garbage and recycling company, because Amazon, better than any other company, knows what people are consuming, and it knows when people are throwing stuff out, and it knows where the boxes are, and it could probably make better use of that than any other company out there, including the public sector. So we actually brought it in. They had a meeting about it inside the company. Ultimately, they decided not to go forward, but I thought that was a pretty interesting example of like the type of crazy ideas that get thrown around inside Amazon. And oftentimes it's just a meeting and nothing happens, but sometimes it becomes a cylinder that you can speak and speaks back to you and plays music and can tell you the weather. So it's sort of an interesting element of Amazon culture. I actually kind of wish I would have put that in the chapter, but I think it was already too late. So
Alex, did you ever interview Bezos? Like, have you ever met Jeff in person?
I haven't met him. I really think, despite owning the Washington Post, he does not like the media very much. So yeah, I mean, maybe one day we'll be able to talk. But if you look through all the interviews that he's done in the past 5, 6 years, they've almost all been like people in the think tanks and nonprofits that just talk about leadership questions very generally. And he'll talk about culture and stuff, which was helpful to me for the book because I got it. But yeah, I mean, I can't even remember the last time Bezos had a sit down with a reporter.
Do you think he'll read the book?
I hope so. I think
on
he
his
would.
Kindle, on his Kindle while he's audibling it.
That's his catchphrase on the cover. So
yeah.
Let me say this. I know that there will be CEOs inside this book that will read it. I can't say more than that, but I know that there will be. So.
Speaking of Audible, I mean, Amazon has made so many acquisitions that I think a lot of people don't realize. So Audible is an obvious one, but IMDb. So, throughout your conversations, I mean, I know this really isn't kind of, part of the theme of the chapter, but when it comes to like acquisitions or spinning or like, just buying businesses that they're not spinning up themselves, like, did you have any conversations around that or can give us like a little peek into kind of their thought process there?
I heard almost nothing about acquisitions. I was talking to people. I really don't think, I mean, yes, there have been some very big acquisitions in Amazon's history, especially when it was building the retail business. But right now, I really think that the priority is them inventing things inside in a way that you don't see in most other tech companies. Like Facebook obviously is acquisition friendly, and that's addressed in the Facebook chapter. Like they acquire and they copy. Amazon, I mean, if you think about I guess Whole Foods is a good example, right? Of one that they've done. They've acquired strategically, but I think they're much more interested in building internally.
Cool. All right. So let's go over to Evan Stein. I don't know how many Evans are in here, but Evan Stein, you're up next.
Yeah. Hey, Alex. I was wondering kind of if you got any feeling. Can you hear me this week or did I do the double mute again?
Oh, no, you're muted. You didn't mute
I was
at all.
wondering if, all right, good. I was wondering if you got any sense of like what the employees' work-life balance, or if that's even a concept within Amazon in terms of like promoting the health and wellness of the people there. Do they promote, family type culture, or is it all that, very strict kind of, you can't let your foot off the gas. We have to constantly be always day one, always reinventing, always competitively working to figure out, anticipate what's coming next. Is that something they talk about, or you got any sense of at all what from your time there?
I did speak to people about this. So first of all, like I also think that always day one doesn't necessarily mean that you have to work your ass off. Like I think that if you work in a reinventive company, it doesn't mean you're killing yourself like a startup. It just means thinking like a startup. So, I do think, and it's sort of like, how can we not get so attached to our current business that we can't think of anything else? And so, yeah, I do think Amazon employees work hard. There's no doubt about that. It's probably a little better than it was before the New York Times article. Like they've made real changes after that article, even though they say that the article didn't spark any changes, like they've made changes afterwards. That's made it more pleasant to work. But yeah, I mean, you hang out with Amazon employees off the clock and they're carrying a beeper, just in case something happens, because you know that if that website goes down or if something's wrong in a retail category, it can cost millions of dollars very quickly. And I had like, I think that like the people that work there today are fairly content in terms of the amount they need to work. But yeah, back in the day, like I was speaking to this one ex-employee who said that when he got the job at Amazon, he goes to his family and he goes, okay, daddy's going to war. Sat them all down and worked right through Thanksgivings and Christmases, and which, anyone who's on Amazon looking for Black Friday deals on Thanksgiving, like there's a human on the other side of that has to be responsible for that. So that's what you see with the employees there. So yeah, it's a tough work culture. It's not as bad as it used to be. I'm sure there are worse companies out there. But yeah, you work hard when you're there. No question about it.
All right, so I think we're going to take a last question from Craig, and then Alex, before we go, want to get a preview from you on what to expect from the Facebook chapter, which is next week. I'm trying to find Craig to unmute him. Ah, there he is.
Yep, I'm
Great.
here. You got me. Thank you.
Hey,
Hey, Alex, how's it going? Thanks for the shout out earlier. I remember those meetups well, journalism meetups in New York City. I wanted to ask you about Amazon. You talked about they're typically secretive and they don't do books. And I think you said something earlier about something like they didn't like a portrayal of their company that someone had written before. And I was just wondering if you've gotten any reaction yet from anyone at Amazon on how you portrayed the company.
I have. I guess I can't talk too much about how they reacted. But like, I've weirdly heard from Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, and have not heard from Google and Microsoft. But I mean, it's a pandemic, so it's probably why. But yeah, I can say that I am confident I'm not going to get sued by Amazon on this one. So, but I guess I should hold my breath on that. But yeah, I know. There's part of me that wants to like have it. It was just basic communication, and part of me really wants to sit down and be like, well, how did people react inside the organization? What do you think? But it's sort of this like weird territory between reporters and PR people that like you kind of just don't want to get into that territory, because it opens up all sorts of problems once you start saying, what did you think about it? But maybe one day I'll find out maybe 20 years down the road, I'll be like, hey, so what did you actually think? So, or maybe someone who writes another book, like we'll say, we'll give them the feedback about what Amazon thought. Because I certainly heard, maybe not necessarily from the PR people, but from people inside the Amazon orbit about the Everything Store, which Brad Stone wrote. And Brad actually found Bezos's biological dad. And I don't think that sat very well inside Amazon. So, maybe someday people will be like, hey, you writing about the New York Times article really pissed them off. So we'll find out. Can I ask a question before we jump off? I'm just kind of curious, people who read through the chapter, did anyone see anything applicable from the Amazon experience you could put into place inside your company? Or did it seem like this sort of alien Death Star that, exists outside of the way that you work? Like, was there any sense one way or the other on that front? I guess you can raise your hand and unmute, or.
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
I saw Rebecca raise a hand.
Yeah, okay.
Let's unmute her.
Oh, Rebecca, your audio is.
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, I mean, writing has zero credibility anymore, it seems, in society. All of my students are like, I want to get my high-paying job. I want to get out and make money. And I was just stunned to read about this or learn about this memo and the opportunity for education and the way that people really focused on I mean, if you look at an 11-point type with like 1-inch margin or single space, that's an ugly document. That's ugly. And no one would normally want to take a look at that and pay attention to what the content is. And so that means to me that the content is actually really special and really careful. And so I took this as something that I could maybe bring back to where I, live in academia and say, look, people, you have got to start paying attention to rating.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I think Hal raised a hand.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, just had a sound issue. I would say customer obsession. When I was reading it, that's the one that really spoke to me. And I'm not working at a company right now. I'm working on an MBA, but I'm studying marketing. And inside the marketing program, you always start with the customer. If I had $1 or preferably a Chipotle burrito for every single time I've heard that, I would have a lot of Chipotle burritos and it would be great. So, I mean, the way I read it is, wow, every single company that decides to take on this mindset is going to need to have marketers right there. And that's one of the reasons why I asked you about Steve Ballmer on Twitter, because he is one of the few CEOs who came directly from marketing. And why I asked the question last week.
Yeah.
That was kind of my main takeaway, just the importance of marketing because customer obsession is such an important thing. And that's what a marketer does.
Great.
Then Marco chatted into, at work, I asked supervisors to write 2-3 lines on how to solve problems and really think through how to get it accomplished. I think it provided them with a sense of ownership to drive improvement, takeaway from Amazon's idea. And then Brendan apparently always wants to have an agenda, which I completely agree with.
It's amazing. I wrote this op-ed that we're still trying to publish, but about like how we can solve the meetings now that we're like no longer gathering in conference rooms. And like, to me, the most annoying part about a meeting is you sit there and you spend 70% of it just trying to figure out why you're there and trying to catch up everybody on what's happened, because everyone comes in with varying degrees of knowledge about what you're there for. And that's the cool thing about the memo, is it just brings you up to speed. And then by the time you finish reading it, everybody's on the same page. And it just makes meetings more productive. So I hear you.
You have everyone's like undivided attention too, right? Because like multitasking is like this illusion. But all right.
Meetings are just sitting in there and just being like, okay, everybody recap what you've done that everybody except for one person in the room knows about. It's so annoying.
It's the worst. So we're at time. Do you want to say a few words about next week's chapter, which is Facebook and its culture of feedback?
Yeah. Is there something we should look out for before we dig in?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining tonight. This has been awesome. And I love how we have like a good crowd 2 weeks running. It makes me really happy. Tune in next week and I'll bring you inside the room with me and Mark Zuckerberg as we discuss feedback and the way to run a company and how he's been surprised by some employees' ideas and struggled, but then eventually decided to go with them and what pushed him across that point. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. Facebook was definitely the chapter with the most access. So I definitely spoke with the most executives of any company when speaking about the Facebook stuff. So I'm happy to cue you into those conversations. In terms of like a discussion topic, the chapter is all about feedback. And I think this is sort of going to be a theme for us, right? The whole thing that these tech giants do well is they break down barriers that would normally keep ideas from traveling to decision makers. With Amazon, it's the six-pager, you write it down and then it can go throughout the organization. With Facebook is this culture of feedback where people feel good about taking ideas to their skip level manager or even a Zuckerberg, and they're taught that receiving feedback is a good thing versus something to be afraid about, because it's all about letting ideas circulate. So I would say I like this at the end also. It's cool to hear people's perspective about how it applies to your companies. So I would say as you read the Facebook chapter, think about how feedback works inside your company and whether it's practiced and how it could change and be used for more productive purposes. And we can pick it up there next Wednesday.
Sounds great. Thank you so much to everyone for joining, and we will see you next week.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. This was awesome.